And ma'am, it is an absolute honor to host you.
Thank you.
Right. So my first question to you, sir, and Dr. Dua, is that the data with regard to the percentage of employment in the informal sector is highly contested, with different sources reporting different percentages of employment coming from the informal sector. The Niti Aayog reports 85%, and the informal sector reports 93% of employment in the informal sector, with no particular source for such information. Such ambiguity is a cause for concern, which prompts the question: how can we clearly define unorganized labor and the informal sector in our country?
You want me to respond? You want me to respond first, or someone else is going to speak?
Please go ahead, sir.
Okay. As you know, in many of these development economies, the importance of the informal sector has gained momentum. And obviously, the question comes up, how do we estimate the informal sector? There are various definitions as per which the NSS is trying to estimate the informal sector. Also, there are alternative sources. For example, the DGET, the Director General and Training from the Ministry of Labor, they have also tried to come up with the estimation of unorganized enterprises. Of course, the definitional characteristics tend to differ across various sources, and that is one of the reasons why we are able to see that the estimates are also different. Now, if you rely on the DGT data, obviously the share is 93%. But if you look at the NSS information, then you realize that they are not always able to capture the basic characteristics in terms of which the informal sector has been defined. If you look into the theoretical literature, what are the major characteristics? The small size, very low levels of technology, perfect competition in the factor and the product market, absolutely no security to the workers or to the enterprises. These are the four major dominant characteristics in terms of which the theoretical underpinnings have been developed. But when you arrive at the empirical estimates, it is very difficult to implement all these characteristics. So what the DGT will do, they will apply primarily the size criterion. And in terms of the size criterion, they would say that, well, about 93% of the workers are engaged in the informal sector. And another important practical problem is that other than informal sector, there is the concept of informal employment. Informal employment will include not only the informal sector, it will also include those who are employed in the formal sector in informal capacity. So how do you account for that? So when you include the casual workers, the contractual workers working in the formal sector with the employment in the informal sector, then you have the entire ambit of informal employment. So it all depends on exactly what one is referring to. So NSS in some of the surveys have tried to gauge the informal sector employment. In certain other surveys, they have tried to address the informal enterprises. In certain other services, they have to include the informal employment. So as a scholar, if you are aware of these differences, I don't think then it would really make a practical problem. I will stop here. Let others speak.
Yes. Sir and ma'am, would you want to add to that? Right. So I think we'll move on to our next question. So my next question to you, sir and ma'am, is that how can we ensure that the GDP and its various proxies, the rates of growth, expansion, and recovery, which have become the very language of the nation's economic reportage and debate, includes the informal sector, given that the informal sector could contribute to over 50% of the GDP, according to the Government of India statistics? And the concept of hidden growth does not remain hidden anymore, but is clearly defined and well accounted for. Any of you can go ahead, please.
So, shall I? Okay.
So,
Of course, when you talk about the national account statistics, it obviously includes the contributions made by the informal sector. If you look into the national account statistics pertaining to the manufacturing sector, you would find that there is a distinction between organized manufacturing and unorganized manufacturing. Of course, for other activities, they do not give you the figures differently for the organized and the unorganized sector. However, once in a while, they do make an attempt to give you the value addition figures for the organized and the unorganized sector. Of course, the nomenclature is very different. They don't use the formal and the informal nomenclature. Rather, they use the organized and unorganized. So unorganized is defined in slightly in a different manner, which can be taken as a proxy for the informal sector. The unorganized sector will be defined as those who are engaged in very small enterprises, less than 10, and 10 to 19 without using power. Okay, that is how the unorganized sector is defined. Now, if you presume that these enterprises are representing the informal sector units, to some extent, it can overlap and it can give you certain estimations. So, there is no doubt that our total GDP figures do include the figures, the value addition contribution of the informal sector. However, the question which you are posing here should be treated in a different manner, that whether the proxies or the estimation that is coming from the informal sector is accurate or not. Yes, in that context, I would like to say that the estimations that, or contributions that we have from the national account statistics is not always reflecting the reality. At times, it is underestimation of the contribution made by the informal sector workers. I give you one example, the garbage pickers in Delhi. So one Japanese scholar, Yujiro Hayami, had conducted a survey of the garbage pickers, and he was trying to estimate the amount of contribution in terms of value added that they are making to the economy. And following the income expenditure method, he came to the conclusion that they are making enormous contribution in terms of city domestic product. However, the earnings that they get in return is much less than the contributions they are making. Now, if you are taking their earnings as a proxy for value addition they are creating, then obviously it is a gross underestimation of the reality. So we do not actually have accurate estimates of the GDP coming from the informal sector. What we have are certain broad proxies, and those proxies can, of course, be valid, but nevertheless, they are included in the national account statistics.
right. Mr. Akif, would you like to share your thoughts on this as well, or Ms. Ruha as well? Would either of you want to share your thoughts?
I'm going to excuse myself from the more academic discussions and leave that to
Right.
people more educated than me in this sphere.
Right, ma'am. Um, so, um, Mr. Akif, would you like to share your thoughts on this as well? Okay.
I'm not entirely sure if you can hear us.
I think there must be some. Okay, we apologize for some. There must be some technical issues from his end. We'll move on to the next question till then. Um, so I'd like Ms. Ruha to answer this because it's centered around health. Ma'am, as you're aware, the informal sector accounts for around 80 to 90% of the total workforce in India. A large number of these workers are not covered under any social security scheme and don't have any healthcare insurance. As a result, when there is any medical emergency, they have to opt for expensive private healthcare, which leads them to fall into a poverty trap. Wouldn't it be great if there was a ration card for basic healthcare too? What is the cost benefit analysis against us in such a situation?
Okay, thank you for that question. And you are right to identify it as a massive issue in India in terms of lack of a social security or safety net. There are these numbers that I remember reading a couple of years ago, which I have to keep verifying every time I'm going to use them again because they're so bizarre and so large that it's hard to believe they're correct or real numbers. So the numbers go something like this: 55 million Indians are pushed into poverty every year because of having to fund their own healthcare. And out of these 55 million, 38 million fall below poverty due to spending on medicines alone. This is a Public Health Foundation of India research that happened a few years ago. And as somebody who's worked in the government sector as a doctor, as well as in low income settings, mostly focused around Delhi, I can tell you that these numbers, although really, really large, are reflected in what our ground or reality looks like as practicing physicians with such a population. Add to that what we've seen unravel over the last 12 to 13 months in terms of COVID, the necessity of having a health insurance or some sort of health coverage, which makes things more streamlined and reduces out of pocket expenditure, which is honestly the biggest issue. It's not so much as the things being expensive, it's really a lack of insurance coverage. The private insurance coverage is less than 5%. Again, numbers that are incredibly mind boggling. So, reducing people's out of pocket expenditure becomes really important, and that can only happen through an insurance system in place. Now, that has been the thinking behind the government of India's Ayushman Bharat program. That was again something that I was very closely working with while I was at Niti Aayog between 2017 and 18. So I was there from the inception to almost the rollout of Ayushman Bharat. Ayushman Bharat program itself has two parts. One part focuses on improving the services that are being provided at hospitals, centers, and clinics in the public healthcare space. And the second part is to look at insurance. Now, they've obviously worked out the numbers. I haven't been a part of the government since the implementations happened, so don't really have insight into how effective the implementation is. We don't really have numbers how it's helped people not fall into poverty because of healthcare or catastrophic expenses, as the term is used. So that would be a very interesting study to do to see how this has been rolling out and affecting people. And the thing is that this question that you'd stated hits a really, really relevant point. But the last part of your question talks about, does the cost benefit analysis fit, right? And honestly, it doesn't matter. I mean, healthcare is the basic human right. It who cares if it is expensive? It is the duty of the state to provide that to its citizens to the best of its abilities. And dare they make an economic argument saying that, oh no, paise nahi baith rahe iske liye. So that's something we should continue to ask the state to deliver on, and the quality, quantity, length, and breadth and width of what's being provided should continuously be raised. So that's those are my quick thoughts on it. Thanks for the question again. And to everybody who's joined it, I'm so sorry my camera's off. I meant to keep it on, just can't seem to figure out.
That's definitely not a
Yes.
problem. Hearing you is an honor for us. So, would you like to go ahead?
Abhi, can I add
So, please go ahead.
yes, it is very. In terms of our service, we have noticed due to the lack of social security, many of these informal sectors turn to the private sector. Of course, they cannot afford to go to the expensive ones, but as a result, they catch hold of the quacks. And obviously, the treatment that is offered to them results in various adverse outcomes. And in the context of cost benefit analysis, I think what would be useful to do that what are the alternative schemes that the government can provide, or in what way the private sector practitioners can be roped in and a cost minimizing mechanisms can work out. So you have several modes, let's say, the private practitioners who have been roped in through certain incentives, and then you have the pure government healthcare system. So then one can work out the cost benefit analysis and can see that which one is more efficient, and efficient not only in terms of resources utilized, also in terms of delivering the services. I would like to put it with that perspective.
Okay. Can I add some?
So please,
Hello.
go
Yeah.
ahead.
Yeah, yeah. As for the, social security is concerned, uh, uh, now the social security code has been, passed by the government of India, and that social security code, which will provide the framework for include the organized and organized sector workers under the ambit of comprehensive social security. So this will definitely help, and it will contain the provision relating to EPFO and ESIC services that will, be extended for the construction worker maternity benefits, gratuity and social security funds for the unorganized sector. Under the under the Social Security Code, the scope of the ESIC and EPFO is being extended for the plantation workers and other gig and platform workers and institutions working with less than 10, workers. Many plans are, need to be, formulated. Provision for Social Security Fund has to be made for the workers working under the organized sectors. For that, this social security code will definitely help to cater the needs of the, workers working in the unorganized sectors. Yeah.
Yes.
Yes, Mr.
Um,
Javed, you have said it very rightly that the Social Security Code has been in at place. It is definitely going to contribute to the welfare of the workers. I would say a limitation of this particular code is that it is yet to be developed. For example, they have said at the moment that the workers getting a salary of less than 18,000 rupees a month should be provided with travel, etc., by the employers, in addition to the housing. So I think this code is at a very, very preliminary stage and it needs to be developed and nurtured to a great extent.
Yeah, so I actually agree. Yeah. So we have one last question from our draft before we move on to the questions from the audience. The informal sector itself is laced with inequality, such that the work in certain industries is completely skewed towards the grown males, and the females and the children working in the industry often are vulnerable to working conditions, and since they have no social security, they have nothing to protect them. There's this fact that we found, which is MG Narega received 78% of minimum wages. The women employed received only 78% of the allotted minimum wage. So how can we solve this? Or is the government only liable to, ensure that people receive equal compensation? So, Akib, sir, would you like to start?
Pardon?
So, would you like to start? Ruha ma'am, would you like to go first?
I was actually really interested in hearing Arup sir and Akif sir's response first to this question.
Ma'am, actually, Akib sir is having some trouble connecting.
Yeah, there's some problem actually. I'm not able to hear properly.
So, if you'd like to
But
go first, it would be great.
So I see this as a trend across the public and the private sector in terms of what the wage gap is or
Mm-hmm.
wage inequity is between men and women. And
Right,
we don't look at, the third gender or people who don't identify with this binary norm.
right.
So that being said, it's to answer your question, I don't really have ideas for how does one address this. Um, and I'm not sure that whether these things are not already a part of the policy that we have or the enforcement guidelines that we have for Narega, but just
Right.
making sure that there are perhaps district or regional targets in terms of what is being distributed between men and women, comparing that to what their participation rate is, comparing participation rate to what demand is, and then
Mm-hmm.
comparing demand to what the population split of women and men is. So
Right.
ensuring there's equity or balance or equality in this entire pipeline, not just who's getting how much money, but who's even getting access to Narega work, who even
Right.
knows about Narega. So I
Mm-hmm.
think we have to backpedal and make sure that all these levels, things are appropriately distributed between genders or whatever level of segmentation you want to describe. I would defer this to the academicians on the panel to tell me whether these things have already been factored into the policy or not.
Yes, I would like a few things. The
Yeah,
informal
yes,
sector,
sure, sir.
what we to see that huge role of intermediaries. The employer does
Mm-hmm.
employ or engage the workers directly. And because of this
Right.
role of the intermediaries, we get to see that the wage discrimination is extremely high. And
Oh,
also, the female male wage differences, the children and the adult wage differences are extremely high.
right.
So, if there be certain mechanisms to discourage the role of the intermediaries or to control the role of the intermediaries, I think to some
Mm-hmm.
extent discrimination issue can be taken care of.
So, on that very note, labor unions are mostly the intermediary that are responsible, to take over the rights of the laborers that the contractors are helping these big construction workers, or be it other sectors, get. These are the people who are mostly the intermediaries. But there are a lot of labor union movements where the leader of the unions or the people in power of the unions have been known to have some interests vested in it. Why? I understand that the government cannot have regulations to regulate the unions as well, but what can be done to ensure that there is less exploitation as we move down the ladder, even in a union which is essentially fighting for rights, right?
Yeah. No, when I was using the term intermediaries, I was primarily referring to the contractors.
Yes,
So
I
the
get it.
intermediaries between the employer and the employees.
Hmm.
Now, if this is a very good question, that in what way the labor unions can actually reduce the extent of exploitation. See, here there is a major issue that during the 70s and early 80s, we had unions strong, and they were also patronized by the different political parties. As a result, there were strikes, lockouts, there was tremendous loss in
Right, right,
terms
right,
of value addition, in terms of also mandates, etc.
right.
Over time, particularly the reforms, they have been deregulated to a large
Okay.
extent, though in pen and labor reforms were not undertaken to a very large extent, but in practice, there was a strong collaboration between the employers and the state. And as a result, many of these labor regulations were not practiced, and the labor unions were almost, they existed just for namesake.
Hmm.
Their over the issues was substantially reduced. So from that point of view, it is very difficult at the moment to revive their roles. Rather, I would say that the role of civil society needs to be endorsed, and
I
how the civil society can actually work for the vulnerable ones,
see.
particularly in the construction sector, in other areas of the informal sector. I think the role of civil society needs to be
Hmm.
brought in.
Right, sir. So, thanks a lot, sir. Those were the questions that our team had from the panel. We'll move on to the committee questions. Sorry, the questions from the audience. And we have one that talks about the construction industry. And this is the question that says the informal sector is expanding, and so is the informal employment in these. But if a particular industry is expanding, so the data here that the is given is construction industry has 97.7% of its employees coming from the informal sector and has grown 5.65%. So, if both of these things are growing positively, why hasn't the informal employment gone down? Because the benefit should trickle down.
Yes. Yes, ideally speaking, the formalization should have taken place.
Right.
Ideally, as modern economic growth takes place, a large part of the economy should get formalized. However, even in the backdrop of the experience of the present day developed nations, you will find that informalization is rising because there are several benefits associated with informalization.
I
So
see.
the question is not whether the formal sector should or the informal sector should be growing. If informal sector has tremendous flexibility. So
Mm-hmm.
if the informal sector can be saved from the features of exploitation, then
Right.
I think the informal sector would have certain advantages. So I will not really be worried about whether the informalization is increasing or not. If informalization is increasing along with flexibility and along with social justice to the workers, then I have got nothing to be worried of.
Right. Mr. Akib, so I have a follow-up question on this itself. So, if we are not worried about the informalization, how do we ensure that this informalization is not an indication of rising exploitation as well? Because that just means that there is rising number of people without social security schemes. They are unprotected.
Yeah, actually, government has made many attempts
Mhm.
to regulate. I mean, to regulate the workers and to address the issues of the workers in the informal economy.
Right.
And labor reform is, I mean, on the way, which can be proved as a milestone to
Mhm.
stop the exploitation of the, I mean, workers
Right.
in the informal economy.
Ma'am, Ruha ma'am, is there something you'd like to add?
No, not at this moment. Thank you.
Oh, thanks so much. So we'll move on to the next question by the audience. It's from Divija, and she asks, are the workers in the informal sector stuck in a vicious cycle where they are unable to move into the formal sector? If at all, why? Ma'am, would you like to please start?
I lost you for a hot second. Could you repeat that, please?
Yeah, yeah. So the question is from Divija, and she asks, are the workers in the informal sector stuck in a vicious cycle where they are not able to move to the formal sector? If yes, why?
Oh, that's a great question, and I think it also applies to the rest of the country in so much as social mobility in India has been a problem for a host of reasons, right?
Mhm.
So I think I would see some of that being applicable over here. It's not really a free market situation in terms of if you have the skills, if you have the desire, you can make that jump. So much of being stuck in the unorganized or informal sector is related to what you've been destined at birth itself in India,
I
right?
see. Okay. Mm-hmm.
So, for instance, you have manual scavengers, right? What is
Right.
their chance of mobility from going here to the organized sector? So, how do you promote social and economic mobility in India? I think would affect all of this. And it does come down to issues of caste before we can talk about class mobility.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. That makes quite a lot of sense actually. Akib sir, would you like to add anything?
No, actually, this question looks very simple, but I mean, this is very tough to, I mean, explain. Okay, how this actually informal sector is stuck. There
Mhm.
are, I find, various reasons actually.
I
Uh,
see.
and the biggest reason is, the resources and the manpower, which are not, prepared for the absorption in the formal sectors.
Okay.
Illiteracy and unskilledness is the major, cause, which has actually, which has
Yeah.
actually stuck the informal sectors and not allowed to move into the formal sectors.
Right, right,
Okay,
right.
so
Yeah. So we'll move on to the next question by the audience. It's by Kirti, and she asks, is there any way at all to bring some form of regulation in the informal sector? An example would be fair working hours or social security if we were to start somewhere. Arup sir, would you like to start, please?
Yes, definitely. It is possible to introduce social security for the informal sector. In what way it can be implemented is very important. That the National Commission on Unorganized Sector Enterprises had
Mhm.
suggested certain methods. that how the health benefits can be offered to the workers and their family members. Similarly, the education benefits for the children of the informal sector. And here you can have three parties as stakeholders: the employer, employee, and the government.
Oh,
And the cost has to be shared among the three. And that is how then one will have a commitment to these schemes. It is
so
possible.
this like yes, yes. So about the three stakeholders that you talked about, various employment funds that are given to people in the formal sector as well are based on a similar like a format, right? That's a similar model wherein all these three parties have to be participants so
Yeah,
that they're able to secure the future. But in the
right.
informal sector, sir, the
You
employee
do not have
himself,
any registration.
yeah,
So
the
who is going to
employee
implement
himself,
how
the
it is to
employee
be done?
himself cannot spare that amount every month to help build that fund as a contingency, right? They need it today rather than in the future. So, is the cost benefit analysis against us, sir? If we want to maybe help this employee and the government and the employer themselves decide to maybe help this employee make a fund, is the cost benefit analysis against us?
No, rather than cost benefit analysis, I think what is more important is to create certain special cells which will directly deal with the employers and the employees. We
I
do understand that the government doesn't have any information about the informal sector enterprises.
Mhm.
So, certain special cells can be created, then it can address the issues of the informal sector workers directly.
Yeah. Okay, so this next question that we have from the audience is, while implementing government policies such as public distribution systems or minimum wage, what implementation problems do the institutions face? Akib, sir, would you like to please start?
Uh, yeah, whenever such kind of policies are implemented, that is implemented through, you can say, the implementing agencies.
I see.
For the organized sector, you might have seen a plethora of laws, labor laws, and other laws are applicable for the big
Right.
enterprises. But
Mhm.
for the workers in the unorganized sector, uh, there is a hardly you will find any laws. If you go back to the, previous,
Right.
there is no, a statutory backup for them, and
Mhm.
this sector is so much disorganized that it's very difficult to cater all kinds of, all needy persons, all, so this is the, biggest challenge for for the government and for the people who are also, suffering in this sector.
I see. Okay. Ruha, ma'am, would you like to follow up, if at all?
No, I'll pass. Thank you.
Okay, so I'll move on. So there's a question by the audience, next question, which is with regards to interstate migration in the informal sector, especially with what happened during the pandemic. How do state government policies exacerbate the wage inequality due to this migration? Ruha ma'am, would you like to take this up?
The first thing that comes to my mind is interoperability of social security and social safety measures that states have.
Okay.
So that's what I would want us to work on war footing, because there's so many state level interventions because of the way our constitution defines the federal um,
Mm-hmm.
and state, and then the mixed list basically, or the combined list. So in terms of having ways that systems can speak to each other between states becomes really important. For instance, I mean, sorry, although this happens at the state levels, I can think about instances slightly different, but happening at the central or union level as well, right? In terms of ministries not being able to speak with each other. So this comes to a little bit about, or to your previous question about implementation issues. For instance, the Ministry of Women and Child Development and the
Mm-hmm.
Ministry of Health both have a stake in child health, right?
Right,
And women's health also.
right, right.
But the ability for the data being collected by the Anganwadi worker and the Asha worker to speak to each other, to be able to identify the beneficiary and combine whatever data points are being collected is missing. So interoperability of data, of distribution of everything that we have been able to map for beneficiaries
Mm-hmm.
between relevant ministries at the union level or between states depending on their residencies is something that I think we need to work on war footing for.
So, like, this is not a transparency issue, but this is more of a communication gap. Is this as simple as it is?
Oh, it's not at all simple because it almost does become a transparency issue because people don't want to or entities aren't willing to share. Now,
Oh,
that could be a variety of reasons from being territorial about what you have to there being trust issues between entities to there just being maybe even just like power play and ego because so much of the entities that we have run in the country are personality driven, right? It depends a
right.
lot on, for instance, PDS, right? It's done through
Mm-hmm.
Food and Civil Supplies ka department
Right.
at state levels. So
Mm-hmm.
their ability to distribute, for instance, fortified salt or salt which has iron in it and can help reduce maternal anemia, which is the largest cause of indirect and direct deaths during or for maternal mortality. So it depends on the political will of the person at the helm of affairs over there. If they want to push it forward, they will prioritize it. The issue becomes really, Vedika, that the government does have a lot of pulls and pressures and has a lot of competing priorities. It's not as if they have abundant resources and they're like, हमें करना ही नहीं है ये बस क्योंकि हम लोगों के खिलाफ है. That's not the issue, right? The issue is there are limited resources and there are a lot of competing priorities.
Yes,
The
yes, for sure.
problem then becomes is how do you build a case for prioritizing this? Right? For prioritizing, say, interoperability of services or data or distribution mechanisms. I
Right.
think it's a very strong case to make for that
Yes,
because
please.
it will bring more efficiency into the system and thereby, for all logical reasons, be able to drop costs as well.
Yeah, yeah, because there'd be intersecting needs, intersecting movements. So I think cost would actually go down. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So there's this next question that I'd like to take up is by Sagar Jain, and he says, "Is informal sector better than the formal sector, or do both have their own benefits?" So this comes to the point that Sir Arup Mitra pointed out, which he said he wouldn't be very willing to push formalization, but improve informalization. So, what are the benefits of both these sectors?
Number of benefits are associated with informalization, that
Mm-hmm.
particularly the flexibility concept, the
I see.
productivity driven product. If you want to implement that
Mhm.
wages to be associated with productivity, it's very easy to then implement in the informal sector context. Whereas in the formal sector, you have several regulations. Even when you find a person is not at all contributing to the growth of the organization, you simply cannot fire him. Okay, so there are many such issues, and also expansion in employment. A new technology has come and you want to sort of implement certain employability skills, etc. So it's very difficult to go ahead with the training programs within the formal sector. There can be rigidities, there can be sort of resistances from the workers, whereas in the such kind of flexibilities exist. Unfortunately, the informal sector in the developing country context, and particularly in South Asian context, you have it's sort of dwindling at a very low levels of productivity, low levels of technology, and severe exploitations. So the
Right.
question is, retain the flexibility, but we try to improve upon those limitations so that we are able to get the benefits of both the worlds.
So about this flexibility, so we had a session yesterday with Mr. Pavel Chakravarti from the University of Lancaster, and he said that sometimes when the MSMEs wish to keep themselves informal so that they can keep on getting tax benefits and hold that,
Right.
hold that heading, or they can remain an MSME because there's a lot of
Mhm.
benefits, but that leads to a lot of misallocation of resources. So is this informal, like consistent informalization or retained informalization, a hindrance to companies as a whole?
See, that we should not be using this term informal and formal sector. We
I
should have the concept of informal and formal in the context of certain aspects of the organization. So
Okay.
let's say the aspects will be informalized and these aspects should be formalized. Then I think we will have a better balance.
I see. Okay, okay. Makes sense. Yes, sir. Hmm. So, I'll take up one last question from the audience before I think we'll be out of time. So, there is a question by Dia, and she's asking, moving the rural population out of agriculture and developing more manufacturing or industry based jobs in these underdeveloped regions, is it the solution to the problem? Would it help promote welfare or, improve their standards of living, the labor in the informal sector? Ma'am, would you like to please take up this question?
Yeah, that's completely out of my depth, Vedika.
Akif sir, would you like to please attempt answering this?
Yeah, uh, uh, when the workforce migrate from, agriculture base to non-agriculture base, they migrate for the jobs, or these workforce are surplus agriculture workforce.
Yeah,
Okay.
disguised
Uh,
employment,
yeah,
right?
yeah. And they search in the urban areas in search of non-agricultural, jobs.
Hmm.
And it happens regular on a regular basis. But if you go back in, early days, so this was because of structural changes. Actually, structural changes happens in the informal sector also.
Okay.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
And when the industrialization was taking place, a lot of structural changes in employment was done, and it happens over a period of time, and all they who are migrated, they are the surplus agriculture force basically.
Yes, yes,
Yeah,
yes.
yeah.
So, so,
Can
so,
I add a few
yes, sir.
sentences?
Yes, sir.
Can I
Please.
add to this?
Yes.
Yes, if you are trying to make a comparison between the manufacturing or industrial jobs vis-a-vis the services jobs,
Right,
of course, one would suggest that the informal sector workers will benefit if industrialization takes place,
right,
because given that they are highly unskilled and or they belong to the semi-skilled variety of workforce,
right,
it would be
right.
easy of them in the manufacturing sector. On the other hand, if they will have to be absorbed in high productivity services sector, the skill requirements will not match. The mismatches are substantial. On the
Yes.
other hand, plethora of low productivity informal jobs in the services sector, but
Hmm.
by absorbed in those activities, they really do not benefit. So it is the
Okay.
industrialization. In fact, the entire debate has, in the context of the developing countries, has now shifted to this particular proposition that this deindustrialization in the developing countries has actually led to a rapid expansion in the informal sector, and
Oh,
such kind of formalization is actually overlapping with high incidence of poverty.
I see. Yes, sir. Yeah.
Formal sector employment and poverty tend to have substantial overlaps.
Yeah, sir. I see it. Uh, thank you. Thank you, speakers. This was the last question for today. We are working with a time constraint. Thank you so much for cooperating with us, for being patient with us, for agreeing to come and answer our questions, engaging with our audience, and helping us host such a wonderful session on some topics that we've been wanting to talk about for over half a year now. I'd invite President HCON, Ananita Jena, to formally conclude the session.
Thank you, Vedika. Thank you to all the three dignitaries for taking time out from their busy schedule and joining us here today. It was an enlightening session, and I'm pretty sure that our audience would take a lot out of it. So, thank you so much again. We would also like to thank everyone who joined us here today. Without your support, this would not have been possible. Our next session is at 2 p.m., which is on ease of doing business and the inequality that we see prevalent there. So, do join us, and thanks again.
On a side note, speakers, all three of you, sometime or the other, mentioned that literacy was one of the reasons why there's a clash in formalization and there's difficulty in formalization. We have a session scheduled for education as well today at 4 p.m. with Mr. Meghna Desai. It would be lovely if you all join. Thank you so much.